Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don. Welcome, everyone, to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on cybersecurity maturity model certification. I guess we're going to have to call this version 2.0 now. My guest today is Allison Giddens. I want to mention to everyone that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC, and that's primarily who we have in our audience today. I want to thank you all for attending and invite you to send some questions for Allison in the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work those into the conversation today as much as I can. I'll start with an introduction of Allison. Allison, returning guest here on this series. Allison she worked for a small business manufacturer, Wintech, an aerospace precision machine shop for 14 years before buying the company in 2020. She and her business partner, John Hudson, now serve as co-presidents, leading this 32-year-old company through the pandemic and into CMMC. Allison also volunteers on the CMMC accreditation body Industry Advisory Council, the IAC, making sure that the voice of industry is heard by those that are forming the CMMC ecosystem. So today we're going to be discussing her reaction to the recent CMMC 2.0 announcements, both from the perspective of what it means to her company at Wintech, and then also in her role as a member of that Industry Advisory Council. Welcome, Allison. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ed.
So let me just jump right in and start with your reaction as a contractor to CMMC 2.0 news. DoD announcement stated goals of supporting businesses in adopting the needed practices and minimizing barriers to compliance. So as you see it, did they achieve or at least move towards those goals?
So yeah, I think that's really the question on everybody's minds. And as a small business owner, I will say they moved towards achieving those goals for sure. At a glance, they did. I think the initial thought is that the cost burden is gone, which it's not. But one of the big things that business was clamoring for was clarification. And although 2.0 doesn't answer every question, it did answer a lot of them. So I feel like there's been a little bit of relief, may or may not be the right word to look for, but essentially we were just told to refocus on NIST 800-171. And if you think about it, those Delta 20 that were removed, they're meaningless to a company that doesn't even have an inventory of hardware and isn't even taking 800-171 into account today. So essentially, I think it does get us closer to that goal of focusing on the most needed, the lowest hanging fruit of the cybersecurity practices and minimizing those barriers to compliance.
Good. I mean, the fear, I think, was that people would give up, right? would exit the defense industrial base. And I mean, so in that sense, if the barrier is that high, then that people can't figure it out, don't feel like they can comply, they're going to go do business elsewhere. That's obviously a loss, to the benefit we see from those innovative small businesses. So I'm glad to hear you say that. And you guys aren't new to the defense industrial base and probably never thought about exiting over this, but there are some companies, that are just getting started.
Oh, sure.
That's a real fork in the road they have to take.
Yep. So
DoD mentioned that they had 850 public comments on the interim rule that they published a year ago. As a small business, as maybe one of those 850 commenters, certainly at least indirectly, if not directly, do you feel that they listened to those concerns? Does CMMC 2.0 address the concerns and needs that you might have expressed?
I think it addressed some of the concerns. It didn't address everything, and I know we'll get to a lot of things from CUI to CUI marking to POAMs and everything along the way. I don't think they really covered perfectly, but I wasn't looking for perfect. I recently attended a couple of events, and I had the opportunity to hear Mr. Jesse Salazar speak. And I got to admit, I was mentally prepared to disagree with him, just going into it, because I'm a small business manufacturer, small business owner. I think it's in my blood that I'm supposed to assume government is out of touch. But that said, I did feel as he was honestly trying to figure out the best solution. And I know that CMMC is not 100% up to him, but it was reassuring hearing a lot of that perspective And from the small business perspective, to hear him acknowledge a lot of those small business concerns. And if you think about it too, he's kind of in a tough spot. So either they've got to stand firm on the original version of CMMC, knowing that it was going to set up a lot of people for failure, and then watching an expected devastating supply chain disruption and asking the question, would that really make national security safer? Personally, I didn't think so, just because of the sake of the chaos that it was going to bring. Or you could look at option 2, revise CMMC to some sort of variation, and that just turns out to be 2.0, to enable a more immediate, and of course this is relative immediate in the world of that we're in today, an immediate effort to, again, grab the lowest hanging fruit that you can take care of today, in theory.
It does seem like, yeah, immediate is relative, but it does seem like the goal is to try to speed things up. I got an audience question that related to your comment earlier about clarity and clarification. And the question is about, when we move back to NIST 171, are we going to lose sort of the nomenclature of the CMMC standard and go back to the NIST numbering, which the answer to the audience member is we don't know how that's going to come out. So I'll reword that question a little bit and say, we gained in the CMMC standard a lot of additional clarity with explanation, examples, et cetera, that were not in the NIST standard. So I'm curious about how much value you see in those. Is it your hope that some of that clarity sticks around? Because I think all of us who saw the same 110 controls come into the CMMC standard were pleased to see that those same controls had more clarity than they had in the previous iteration.
I think so. I think especially because 800.171 was so much on privacy, it was focused on the privacy side. This kind of allows us to migrate into, whether it's manufacturing or defense contractor services, it kind of allows for a little broader reach of interpretation, while at the same time giving clarification, if that makes any sense. But no, I agree. I don't know what they're going to do about the numbering system. I mean, my gut tells me it makes a heck of a lot of sense to use NIST, because if it's not broken, don't fix it. But then again, it's broken, so we're trying to fix it. So no, I don't know the answer to that one either. Your guess is as good as mine.
No, have 2 columns in your spreadsheet, and then whichever one
there you go.
And be ready to add a 3rd column if necessary. Let's see. Moving a little bit towards the process here, self-attestation is a big factor, right? So that has not worked real well in the past. And there's some out there who've said, hey, it'll never work. It's a terrible idea. DoD expresses it in terms of trust and collaboration, that that we're going to believe you if you say you've done some things, and try to guide you to answer those questions intelligently. I personally fully expected level 1 third-party assessment to be greatly simplified, because there are only 17 things. Do you really need an on-site visit, et cetera? So I expected that, but I didn't expect them to completely do away with it. And then taking it away for some of the CUI holders, even more surprising. Do you think this is a move to ease the entry point and speed the rollout? You mentioned speed earlier, by avoiding a potential bottleneck of C3PAO availability, or do you see this as maybe a change of thinking that might last beyond this rollout period?
I definitely agree that this had a lot to do with that bottleneck. I think that the powers that be recognized that the C3PAO bottleneck was going to have significant impact if we kept rolling down the path that we were on. The last thing that you want is for a group of businesses to be ready for assessment, and you're limited by the number of assessors, and therefore you're limited by production on some sort of critical infrastructure part, required by DoD or for national defense, or, oh gosh, what kind of nightmare you're dealing with then. Then all of a sudden you've got these, waivers that may come in, and somebody kind of makes up the rules as we go along just to try to get production flowing. You don't want any of that. So I think that the bottleneck issue was integral to a lot of this. But I think even deeper than that, the unknown was integral. So we talk about the bottleneck all day long, but the exact numbers and the exact numbers of need, I don't know that we necessarily have a good grasp on. I mean, I know that the number 300,000 has been thrown around a lot for when it comes to how many businesses are in the DIB. I keep hearing 300,000 is kind of that number, but do we even know? I mean, if we were to sit here and say, well, how many of the 300,000 on CMMC 1.2 would have needed L3 assessment? we could say 80%. Again, these are numbers that I'm hearing, and I don't mean to perpetuate rumors. And I suppose since this version of CMMC is no longer the version we're going on, it doesn't matter. But you have all of these unknowns, and for us to say, well, you know what, we don't have enough C3PAOs, so let's hold the bus, change up the rules a little bit, and figure out where we can mitigate some risk without throwing assessment to the dogs just yet. So I think that a lot of that came into play.
I've heard so many different numbers on the counts of who would need level 3 versus level 1 in the old model, that I think the answer is nobody really knew. In other words,
Right.
You mentioned rumors, but I think there was speculation, because if there were real facts, they would have come out at some point in this process. So the fact that I kept hearing numbers that were orders of magnitude apart says probably nobody really had a handle on it, and maybe still doesn't, which is fine. It's understandable, right? Visibility into the depths of the supply chain is not something that we're strong on at this point.
Yes.
But one thing I think everybody, the total count seems to run in that 250, 350,000 range, although that's still a pretty big range, but it gives us a clue. One of the audience members asked, is it still going to be mandatory? I mean, I think everything we're hearing is, yes, that number hasn't changed, right? The total number of people who need it hasn't changed. And the number that need to be level 1 or the new level 2, that hasn't changed. In other words, the criteria for being in those 2 levels is the same, essentially. Either have CUI, in which case you're in that middle level, or you don't, in which case you need that lowest level, right?
But even then, right, even the CUI is going to be different. So now they're talking about the prioritization of CUI.
Splitting that
So
in half, right?
I think that that's going to kind of come into play too. That's a piece that I think by clarifying requirement, they ended up, they answered one question and then they brought up 2 more by really what determines that prioritization. Somebody had mentioned maybe DPAS rating. Somebody mentioned type of critical project or organization. I don't know what the answer to that is either, but I think that'll be down the line. If you have a bracket that you manufacture for an F-22, is that the same CUI level that, it's been around since whatever, 1970 something on a blueprint? Is that the same CUI level as, the new, some sort of new technology that's been incorporated into the next generation warfighter? I would say that's probably not the same kind of CUI. I would guess that China probably already has the bracket off the F-22, and that it's the newer stuff that we need to prioritize. So again, I don't know what that looks like, but I think that's going to be something that a lot more people start having questions about.
It sounds smart though, right? And like you say, it sounds smart. Before we're having trouble sometimes even identifying what is CUI. And I would say, man, if you're not sure, there's a big problem going on there, right? In other words, that means we need to really dig back and say, what is it we're trying to protect, and think about that across industry, government, everybody. So getting a handle on the parts that actually matter and spending our money there does seem smart. I want to shift gears a little bit to your role on the Industry Advisory Council. What are the topics being discussed between the Industry Advisory Council and the AB, at least in as much as you can make that public? What are the big concerns that you're bringing to the AB at this point?
Sure. So recently the IAC kind of rebranded itself to the IAG, so the Industry Advisory Group. I believe there was another industry association that came forward and asked us to differentiate ourselves so we wouldn't get confused. First time I've ever had that problem, but we had no problem changing that, no big deal. So right now we've got a lot of working groups that are starting to come together. Things like talking about costs, things like talking about small business, things about modernization or best practices. Council members finalized a volunteer application. We've asked the AB to post it on the AB website to solicit help from industry. So we'll be asking for people to throw their names in the hat if they're interested in volunteering to serve on IAG Council, the IAG, or one of its working groups. And so there'll be a couple of different ways people can get involved. So we're just waiting on the AB to have the opportunity to upload that to the website. So be on the lookout.
That sounds good. DoD is mentioning that they're considering some incentives for those who want to voluntarily get a C3PAO assessment ahead of a requirement. So the people who might have CUI that's of the not so important category, and would feel like they want to be able to demonstrate compliance in an easy way and not self-attest. I would think this is going to be something that the AB would support. It helps support the ecosystem they've built. So without speculating too much on what the government might do incentive-wise, what are your thoughts about what would motivate companies to take this step? Like beyond a regulatory requirement, what would motivate a voluntary assessment?
A couple of things come to mind. Of course, the easy answer would be cash, but that's I'm just half kidding on that.
It's free,
but
right?
No, yeah, right. But I think having the DoD pay for an assessment would be very significant for starters. So as a small business owner, it's easier for me to justify an investment in software, something that's going to make me better to secure endpoints or personnel to manage tech support or things like that, than it is to justify a third-party visit for a few days and pay tens of thousands of dollars. And a lot of us already do this for ISO or AS 9100 audits. And it's daunting as somebody who looks at a budget to think that you're going to have to add one of these to the calendar and to your budget. I believe that small business owners or business owners in general would be more likely to invest in what would have been delayed security enhancements sooner rather than later if they thought they could get put on a short list of receiving an assessment at no cost to them. So bonus points if by receiving that assessment, they're put on a short list of quote preferred suppliers to government and prime contacts. So I think that would help to differentiate businesses. I think, and of course, providing a realistic due date of POAMs, and I know we'll talk about POAMs later, but they're going to be time bound. So it's not as though it's some infinite ability to just keep kicking cans down the road. But I think that piece has to also be considered on if something like this were to be incorporated.
Let's talk about POAMs now. I actually was next up on my topic list, and as happens often on this series, one of the audience members asked a question and they worded it better than I could have. So I was certainly happy to see the inclusion of time-bound POAMs in a limited way, but it reflects the reality that perfection is elusive, and sometimes when you do a risk-benefit analysis, your resources are better spent on things other than 100% compliance, or it's the 80-20 rule. Sometimes you can spend a ton of money fixing those last one or two things, and it's just not necessarily the best. So let me see if I can get to audience members' wording of that question. That he worded was, do you believe that waivers or POAMs will actually alleviate any of the stresses upon us for usual workloads in our respective estates, especially since many of these workloads require very long-term waivers or POAM items that are likely to take longer than 180 days to resolve? Meaning, if they time-bound and limit it, the things that matter most to us are likely to be outside, unallowed. So what do you think there?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I understand that the POAMs will be time-bound, and I'm trying to think of this from a small business perspective, and I'm torn because there's business decision and there's security decision. And they can often be the same thing, but they can also be drastically different. I think it's a really good question also because it points out the fact that the cost burden on the DIB hasn't really been lifted. It's just been shifted. If we pretend that CMMC 2.0 is written in stone today, November 2021, and let's pretend for a moment in time that there are enough assessors and you, WinTech wants to go get an assessment in December 2021. And I recognize, I'm anticipating ahead of time, I'm going to have a few open POAM items. I think to the audience members, to Peter's point, let's say he's got some sort of, POAM item that, probably be a little bit out there, and he's with WinTech, and we know it's going to be probably 8 months before we can get to that sucker. And having a conversation with the assessor or DoD, what would that look like for some sort of waiver? Or does there would almost have to be a weight to the importance of the item that you are asking to be waived, or a weight to the risk management or mitigation of it. Because I mean, to ask for a waiver for MFA is one thing, but to ask for a waiver for, let's say, well, that's a bad example too. I don't have a really good example. Ask for a waiver for something that really is not on your radar to be of a risk, but you recognize that in your system, it would be a risk, but just the way that you've got process flow is not. I think that comes back down to the CUI talk. So I recently heard that CMMC is built on a house of cards, and that CUI are the cards. And until we figure out how to properly identify CUI, we are not really able to walk through the process flow, and therefore an assessor can't follow our logic of the process flow and thus our compliance. And I think that feeds into the POAMs discussion, and whether or not something warrants a waiver, whether or not something warrants a really long time-bound POAM. I hate to say a case-by-case basis, but I don't see any other way of doing it.
You mentioned a weighting. I mean, we have in the methodology we use to do SPURS scores, we have 5, 3, and 1 weightings on each of the 110 controls. So it seems natural that they're going to say, well, if it's a 5, obviously that's our most critical items. No POAMs for those. Get those things fixed. Unfortunately, if you think about the things that tend to be the long poles in the tent, that technically very challenging to do, we know the usual suspects, right? FIPS 140-2 encryption. I got this perfectly good commercial encryption, but according to U.S. government policy, that counts as 0. It's not encrypted, and that's the official stance, right? If it's not FIPS 140-2, it's as if you turned it off. Well,
Right.
In terms of delaying our adversaries, it's not exactly the same as turning it off, but I get it, right? I mean, there's the government's drawn the line there. They've done it legally, so it's very, very hard, maybe impossible for them to waive that requirement. But it's also, one of the most difficult to implement, because to retrofit on existing systems is usually a full rebuild of the system. So, you have to do it at the time of install. You can't come in later and just flip the switch. It doesn't work that way in most cases. So.
Right. Yeah.
I'm trying to sort out a couple of audience questions here that I don't have my big screen in front of me. There's sort of related to this is documentation. You mentioned the burden has shifted, not lifted, and I think that's so true with documentation, right? They got rid of the maturity processes, so the strict documentation requirements are not there. NIST 171 tailors out all the policy requirements from NIST 853, right? They're considered things that contractors should do on their own, because that's how companies drive things to happen, is they write policies. So they're not an actual requirement under 171. They were under CMMC 1.0. They're not anymore. But it doesn't mean you don't need policies, because you still need to cause things to happen in a consistent, reliable way. So I guess, yeah, this audience member says, hey, one of the biggest complaints about CMMC 1.0 was the documentation requirements, but it's still needed, in my opinion. I mean, what's your thought there on that burden and what we've got with 2.0 in sense of getting rid of the maturity piece?
Yeah, no, this is, I think, one of the biggest things I've heard debated in the past couple weeks. And I think that 2.0 refocuses, realigns us on building the foundation. And those Delta 20, I would not be surprised if they reappeared at a later date in the sequel, or whatever that means. That's no inside scoop. That's just me making stuff up. But in other pieces of the puzzle, I would not be surprised if they showed up. I think that and it's obvious that if a company doesn't do the basics, they can't do those Delta 20. In terms of the documents and procedures, I come from the ISO AS9100 world, where you need objective evidence for every single time you sneeze. So I agree. I don't see how you can necessarily prove that you've got something in place that drives what's supposed to happen. And then, God forbid, you get hit by a bus, those documents need to still exist, so that the assessor, when he walks in the day after your funeral, can say, okay, well, I see that, this is how user accounts who are inactive, this is how those take place. Now prove that to me. And then again, different pieces of the puzzle all come together. So I see a lot of debate about this, but I would be fascinated to learn the people that are adamantly against policies, procedures, how familiar they are with ISO AS9100 in a manufacturing setting. I would venture to guess probably not very, and that's not a bad thing. It's just perspective. I think in manufacturing world that I'm in, again, the ISO AS, we're used to policies, procedures. Again, we we tell you how to make the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and we tell you first you've got to go buy the bread. I mean, it's kind of the no-brainer stuff, but it's just getting manufacturers to understand, all right, now you got to do the same thing for your IT compliance.
I think there's company benefits of doing that, and not just passing the audit, but other reasons why you might want to do it. And the same for a lot of the Delta 20. I mean, the Delta 20, these are things that didn't have to do with confidentiality, so they got tailored out of the NIST 800-171. But that doesn't mean you don't have a need, some need to do that. Backups, for example, right? I mean, because backups is no longer a requirement, are we all going to go turn off our backups in the face of a lot of ransomware attacks? I hope not. Like that would be so that means, I think in a way it's a little bit of a mixed blessing. I think it causes people to say, if you just worry about compliance, it's clearly a limited scope, right? It's just what the government is telling you to do and what they care about. You've got to consider all the things that you care about too, or you're going to be in pretty bad shape. This audience member asks that there's risk management requirement. How do you do that without documentation? How do you meet? So that's the other thing. To meet the intent of those controls in an ad hoc way and do continuous monitoring and demonstrate it to an auditor, I would say is just a fool's errand. Like why would you try to do it that way?
Right. So yeah, and I think you gotta put yourself in the assessor's shoes too. When the assessor comes in and essentially it's brand new to him or her, their perspective is, this is the standard this person, this company has to prove to me that they are doing what is on this piece of paper. You don't want to make it harder on the assessor. You just don't want to.
So I want to ask one kind of a follow-up question on a comment you made earlier about clarity, and that is a big factor, right? I think people want a place to get answers to their specific questions. It's proven really hard. I mean, this doesn't write standards that way, right? And so when you've got a question that's not answered by the standard, do you feel that there should be authoritative resources that suppliers can contact to determine if something that they're proposing to do is sufficient or not? In other words, if they say, look, I don't know if this is good or not good, who should they ask, in your opinion? Is that the AB? Is that the DOD? Is it some other party?
I really believe the authoritative source here needs to be DOD. I mean, having a managed and updated review of posted Q&A, and one that doesn't happen to have conflicting data within the Q&A itself, that would be awesome. It would be a solid resource. And then the AB and any other associated organization in the future would be able to point back to the single source of knowledge, because otherwise there's too many cooks in the kitchen, too many interpretations. And it ultimately, I think it's hurt CMMC's credibility to have the lack of clarification along the way. And when there are multiple people in authoritative positions that are answering the same question different ways, I mean, third-party assessments and interpretation of compliance to a lot of these items, it's going to be challenging enough. And to have a single source to fall back on allows all parties to avoid those gotcha moments.
There's an interesting audience question that I hadn't heard before, but I think I can squeeze it in here if we run over time a little bit. Hopefully we're not too long. This audience member says, one of the C3PAOs we've spoken with alluded to changes in CMMC 2.0 that may allow a C3PAO to conduct both the RPO and the certification audit. This would present savings for smaller companies as auditors can package the assessment and the audit together. Was this your interpretation? Have you heard that?
I have not.
The independence concept?
I've not heard that. I would be stunned if that was real, only because it's the fox watching the chicken coop. I don't know that I would necessarily, I mean, from my perspective, if I liked my assessor, I'd want that person to assess me and then going ahead and assess the assessment and confirm that the audit's good to go. That would be pretty awesome. But I don't know, that's tough. That's am I interpreting the question right?
Yeah.
Ed? I mean, that's
because I'm interpreting the same way I'm interpreting it.
Yeah, and in ISO and AS world, we have to have, so every year we have a third party outside person come in and do kind of our internal review, even though they're from an external party. And then from there, we cannot use that individual for our actual audit. So I would think that it would be the same thing.
I'm with you. I would be stunned. So if you heard that from a C3PAO, that's interesting news. I have not heard it. I would be stunned. And I would say this, looking back in history as a security practitioner, PCI tried this. The credit card industry tried that, where you had people crossing those independence boundaries. It was messy. It got ugly, and they finally had to kind of unsort it. But the industry grew up without a strong independence piece. I don't know. This is about 15 years ago. I'm showing my age, maybe, but well, my age is older than that even. But PCI was mid-career for me. So anyway, the point being, yeah, that was tried and didn't work so well. So I would hope certainly that we don't go down that path. It is kind of time to wrap up. So I'm going to ask kind of a closing question. What's your advice to business owners like yourself that in terms of actions to take right now, based on the threats we're facing, based on some of these changes we just discussed? What's the today takeaway?
I kind of have 3 things to keep in mind. You can manage the risk if you know your risk. So if you've not already done those basics that everybody keeps nagging you about, everything from MFA to inventory control and all that stuff, training your people to look for the sketchy emails, things like that. If you're not already doing that, do that yesterday. Number 2, know that you don't know everything. Talk to someone who handles your IT security, whether that's an MSP, whether that's somebody on site, but also recognize that you are going to get what you pay for. As a small business owner, to see what the going rate is in cyber world, not too long ago, almost made me have a heart attack, but I recognize that, again, you're going to get what you pay for. And number 3, recognize that you do still have to worry about your supply chain. A couple of things that I've noted, if you're working in this space and you're getting contracts from a prime, this is a shout out to all my small businesses, read your contracts. I know that's a novel concept, but watch and make sure that you are not being what I'm calling the victim of brainless flow down. It's through no fault of the primes inherently. It's just a lot of people are on autopilot. Make sure that with all these changes happening, that you're not agreeing to things that maybe shouldn't be in contracts at this point in time. And also that a piece of that worrying about your supply chain, look at your cyber insurance and watch for things like dependent property business income insurance. Was just talking to a colleague the other day that didn't have it. And because one of their suppliers got hacked and they lost business because their supplier couldn't get them the material, they weren't covered. So just watch for those things. Recognize that even if you are jam up and jelly tight, as they say, you still got to worry about the people under you and above you. So that would be my takeaway.
Allison, that's great advice. I thank you very much. Squeezing this one in, one of the audience members said maybe CMMC 2.0 should be called CMC 2.0.
I actually like that. It's good.
I'll disagree. I think it's still about maturity. It's not as formalized as it was in the model originally, but
it's kind of like an ATM machine. Like you wouldn't say an ATM machine, you just say ATM. Yeah, that's good.
There we go. All right, let's wrap this up. We've gone over our time. I'm infamous for that. Thanks to you, Allison, for joining us. Thanks to Wade Forbes, our sketch note artist who's been drawing this. We'll send that out to the attendees after the session today. I want to thank you and the audience for joining and for the great questions today. Please join us for future town hall meetings. We're going to be taking a break next week because of the Thanksgiving holiday, shortening up the week. Our next session will be December 1st at our regular time of 1 p.m. Eastern. If you don't have the details coming to you in your inbox, please hit our website, neosystemscorp.com, for the details. Thanks, everybody.